Hello, everybody. My name is Ian Kirkpatrick. I'm an author, idiot, and loin streamer, and today we're going to be talking about implicit versus explicit storytelling and ideas in text. The idea of this conversation was sort of brought to me both by my own observations or book discussions on this channel, and then like you guys commenting, as well as a Twitter thread that kind of more brought it up to the forefront. Like I have seen, I have had personal conversations with a couple of authors that don't seem to understand or wants to understand the messages that come through in their writing, whether they mean for them to or not. And that's not to say that the authors are intending for those messages to come through. It's just what happens when you're dealing with art. And when people say art is subjective, often this is a lot of what it means. Like, not only are there different ways to interpret art, but there are also different things that people value. So what somebody considers good may be very different depending on if they prefer big world building or flowery prose or very succinct prose or deep characters or a relatable character or a self-insert character, or if they can have fun with the book as opposed to thinking really hard about the book. So even the phrase subjective preference is also subjective. It's one of the reasons why book discourse can be both so wild and so vastly different, and how we can read the same book and come away with something so completely different. Sometimes people read things and only read into the explicit text, like only believe in what is being said in the book. Other times, people will read a book and then pick up on the implicit, the implied story, the implied character. But we're going to get into that in this discussion. But before we get started, number one, if you enjoy what I do here on the channel, please remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Number two, if you would like to be featured on the channel, check out the links down in the description below. The number one way to be featured is through Lemoy, the monthly prompt writing contest, where I give you a prompt, you write a short story using that prompt, and on the first Monday video of the month, we bask in your creative genius, what our contemporary peers are doing. The second way to be featured is if you are an indie author and you have a book out or a book that is coming out. If you submit the first chapter and the cover to the Fresh Meat feature, the chapter will be right here on the channel to hopefully help more readers find your work. Because I may be that reader, I may not be that reader, but hopefully the exposure will help get, readers to know that you exist. Marketing is hard, guys. The third thing is, if you would like to check out any of my books, they are available at any of your favorite places to get books, including the local library upon request or OneDrive, and all of the variations like that. With that said, let's jump into the topic. Today's person of interest, the reason that this came to I want to talk about this, is because of somebody that you may or may not be familiar with. I don't want to dog on the person so much as I just want to use this as a way to get into it, because I've also had so many conversations with authors that have gotten aggressive or called me stupid, or their fans have called me stupid because of different interpretations on things. So this just seems to be an issue in general, and there's no right or wrong way. I say there's no right or wrong way to read a book, and then I read books wrong. But there is no right or wrong way to read a book. It's going to be your experience and how you feel about a story, how you feel about the book, how you interpret the information given to you in the book. And there is one very, very important thing that I don't know if everybody thinks about when they're reading a book. First, I want to ask you, as a reader, do you usually only absorb the content as it's said in the book literally, or do you interpret things in the book? Because you can interpret anything in a story any way that you want, any way that you think. But that's not always what's implied. I think this is also where you start getting into issues with people assuming things about authors based on what's in the book, because there is implied subtext, whether the author knows it or not, but that subtext is going to be translated by the reader based on also the reader's perspective or experiences of the reader. So then you've got double the subjectiveness going on at the same time, which, again, I think it's why book discussion is so interesting, but it can also be so contentious, because there are people that will go, well, if you get a different interpretation than what I meant or what I saw, then you're stupid. And I don't think that's true. I think that there are so many ways to talk about a book, to address a book, and it can be really, really interesting to see how somebody decoded the same information that you got in a very different way, even if it's kind of disturbing. Because I'm looking at all of you people from the Tampa comments section that were like looking at 300 pages of sexual writing and saying that there's things to it. I get that we're different. But that's also why I like to have book discussions. So we're going to use this as a jumping off point to talk about that. I'm going to give probably a couple of examples as we go later in the video, because, you know, I read a lot of things that I can take implications from, or there are no implications in it. That I think some writers are very obviously, for me, writing less implied stuff. And also that's where it starts getting confusing, because you have to start discerning, and at some point you're just not going to. And I'm sorry to be doing it this way, but what better way to talk about implicit versus explicit storytelling, but with examples, especially with an example from a book that I've reviewed on this channel, so you can see that, or go read it yourself, and then we can discuss. So sorry in advance, but here we go. With that said, let's get into this Twitter thread, and there are a couple of things at hand here. First, we're going to start with the sci-fi author James Craig saying he's thinking about doing a long-term pre-scripted video about the issues in Shadow of the Conqueror by Shad and Brooks and how they could have been fixed. Worried that it might be rather dry and technical though. First things first, this is one of the weird differences between readers and writers, is that writers want to get in your face about critiques and like get in the author's face about critiques, when readers are like, reading and book reviews are for the readers. So it's actually generally considered bad. So it's actually generally considered bad manners to tag an author if you're going to do a critical review. Because again, in general, people are told not to go and read the reviews if they're critical. Authors in general are told not to go and touch the reviews if they can't handle it. So then when you start tagging people, when you're going to start dumping on their book, it's generally not considered the best mannerisms, and you don't need to do it. What it ends up looking like is you do want to make the author feel bad. You want the author to know that you're talking about them, especially if you're going to make insults in your work. So I don't know if that was what James was trying to go for there, but it is generally frowned upon to tag an author if it's not a positive review. If it is a positive review, then by all means, generally authors like to see that. But for something that's going, I'm about to just critique you, that turns into what looks like internet blood sports and like what authors do to each other to try to chomp each other down. It makes me think of a couple months ago. Was it a couple months ago now? Was it longer than that? Where the one author started seeing a book review going around of his book, and it called him a sexist. And so he just blocked it so he wouldn't have to see it just going around in the fantasy Twitter area. And then he got dogpiled on for blocking someone for not wanting to see a critical review, and they told him that he had to take it. So then we're in this weird spot of you're both simultaneously not supposed to look at reviews if you're an author, but also if you block a review so you don't have to look at it because it's not for you, you also get dogpiled on. And it's like, what are you trying to do? It feels like trying to force somebody to see what you're saying about them when really that's going too far. If people want to stumble upon what you're saying about them in their work, totally fine. But like smacking somebody in the face with it, tagging them, it's not really normal for the writing community, as far as it's not really good manners. Anyway, Shad obviously responded. At this point, there's nothing wrong with it because the guy is trying to get his attention. However, there are some other things in the rest of this, which is going to be our jump off point. Shad said, "Why are you tagging me in this? Well, if you want my attention so much, here it is. Your review was one of the few that I've watched that were made to try and dunk on it for clout. It was close to the worst review I've ever watched, with so many astoundingly false statements about the book that it was as if you didn't even read it. It was so bad that you're astonishingly incompetent or actively malicious in your intent." Now, pause. I get that this is internet blood sports, which is also why I hate the whole idea of politics, because for a couple of books that I've done, specifically Sam Fenna's Amygdala, Shad Brooks's Shadow of the Conqueror, Will Jordan's Dark Harvest. You can see a pattern here. You got people coming in saying, you only read this because of your political leaning, where nobody knows my political leaning particularly because I don't talk about it online. However, I don't have any of those comments coming at me on any of the ALA books that are considered from the other political direction. But I am accused of only doing certain things in order to clout chase or dunk on stuff. Instead of just, I read this because I read this to get to the bottom of it, because I don't like to see authors being dunked on for what they're writing. And a lot of times when you get into the controversial writers, they end up having their names dragged or the political biases dragged in instead of talking about the book. And I'm not saying that you can't do that or that you shouldn't do that, but as me, a reader who wants to just know what is going on in these books, I'm not particularly interested in the politics of all this other stuff. So then when I go looking for a review, trying to figure out what's in the book, and half of it or more is personal insults on the author, it doesn't really help me get to know what's in the book. Even if the review of the book is totally off according to the author, it still gives me an insight into what is in the book, unless it gets into something personal. But to assume that your readers or your critics are only doing that because they are malicious puts you into question, especially when you run a channel that critiques other media. This also falls into the line of what is explicit and what is implicit. Is James, myself, others reading Shadow of the Conqueror are going to take a situation and read it differently than possibly the author intended, because we don't have, one, the connection to the idea of the intent, or three, the background and understandings and education that would lead us to interpret something the same way. This is also one of the reasons why book discussion or discussion in general, especially with different ideas, is so important, because it allows you to see other people's mindsets, how people think, how people problem solve. And often when I'm asking questions of how somebody put something together or why they like something, it's so that I can better understand the pieces that come together to create that puzzle, that create that understanding. Even if I'm talking to a group of people, everybody is going to have a different interpretation or a different understanding of the exact same thing. And what I want to get to the bottom of is how those pieces click together. So that's often why I ask questions. That's why I like to do book discussions. That's why I like to do stuff like this. Anyway, you've already reviewed my book and lied in some of the most blatant and pathetic ways about it, seemingly for clout, but now want to do a deep dive. How about you reread it to actually get something correct this time? But honestly, I don't have much hope. Now I get that he is angry, but also, that's twice in 2 paragraphs that clout was mentioned. So then there is the assumption here that only a review like this could be done with clout. Now, it might be because he's tagging Shad in this, so that puts us off a bad start, because why else would you do this? This isn't how you respond to book reviews. One of the things that I do clearly remember from recent years is whenever somebody from like Netflix shows or a reboot or a remake of some kind told off people who didn't like the ideas that were going to be in the new show, whenever they responded, there were news articles and videos and video essays about how these people were so ungrateful and they hate you. And then you get this and it's the exact same thing. You don't have to like what people say about your book, but this ain't the look that you think it is. And again, it starts going into blood sports, which also makes it, one, not professional behavior for an author, for a creator of sorts, for a creator of like books, TV, movies, but it also makes people fear actually putting reviews out. Part of this is to scare people from putting reviews out that are critical of your work. The last thing I want to say about that line is that I've received it in my comments as well from fans of Shad Brooks, this assumption that because I got things different from them in the book, then obviously I'm lying, as opposed to I just understood stuff differently. And I get the impulse to want to do that, to want to say that, to defend the person that you like, but I've also had people lie about me. I've also had people just get a knee-jerk reaction to whoever they think that I am, whatever they think that I am, and then lie about me or make assumptions about me in order to justify the insults that they're going to throw at me. I remember a couple of years ago in a video, I said that I enjoy male psychology and studying male psychology, and I had somebody in my comments say, "Why do you hate women?" And so I don't necessarily think that any of it is lying, but I think that people have a tendency to draw an assumption based on something and to guess why you would be so wrong, rather than trying to understand where that person is coming from or how they drew that conclusion. And it is so easy to assume malice, especially when it is against you or your ideas, when often I don't think that that's what it is. Now, I think when you're in more of a political field, it can be much easier to assume malice because some people really are out there to get you. But I don't think most books are actually written or reviewed in malice. Now, sometimes don't take that as there never are, because there definitely are times that there are. But I also think that people just go into things, and if something it ticks them off, if something is annoying, if something is offensive, people are going to be less forgiving of the whole rest of the book. Like, you can start off on a really bad foot, and for me, Shadow of the Conqueror started off on a really bad foot because you had this guy who's 83 saying that he felt bad about what he did and wanted to leave that all behind and was sorry, but was also insulting his enemies in his suicide letter. So he felt insincere from the very beginning. It was that very first letter, that very first introduction to Dalen, that told me he is insincere and he is lying and he will lie to the audience. Other people may not have taken it that way. Other people who may be more familiar with Shad may have taken it as a sense of humor. But me being completely divorced from this person saw that letter where he was saying, hey, look, I'm so sorry, but screw those guys. I'm going to say that they have sex with goats because I hate them, and I hope that rumor follows them well past my death. That tells me that you're not really repentful. And so then throughout the book, if you tell me that you're repentful, I'm not going to believe you unless you do things that show that you're repentful. So then if you continue through the story lying to everybody, including lying to the face of a girl that you raped when she was a child, and then tell her that you were not so bad, i.e. by saying that your dad was not so bad, knowing exactly what you did to her, I'm gonna say I don't believe you, and you're in this for your own self-interest. And you might disagree because you have a different read on that situation, a different perspective, but it's not a lie. This is going to be the difference in interpretation that comes from implicit versus explicit. And the explicit interpretation of a book is going to be exactly what it says. If you read the character saying, I am sorry, he wasn't that bad, he feels really bad for what he did, you're just going to believe it at face value for what was said. Implicit is underlying. It's a way that you would interpret the story as opposed to what you're being told the story is. And we'll get a little bit more into that. Continuing on with Shad, you're a truly dog crap reviewer, and I'm not just saying that. Let's list some of the objectively false statements that you made about my book. Again, you can't, there are objective facts that you can or cannot say about a book. Like one of them that I got, and I'm fairly certain that I annoyed this reader with something in the book to the point that she kind of blocked out stuff. But if you go to the Dead End Drive Goodreads page, you'll see that there is somebody in there that says she didn't know what year it was in the book. She didn't know what time period it was. I think that is also a comment that complained about the racism and fat phobia in the book, which I think are things that often set people off. Now, the reason why I would assume, and that's all that it is, it's just an assumption. I'm not putting anything on the reader. I'm not going to assume the worst of the reader, but the reason why I would guess that something set her off onto a bad foot with the book and led her into saying, I don't know what year it is because at the start of the first chapter, at the start of chapter 20, and then at the start of chapter 22, it has the year. Specifically, right under the title. Then there's one over there that's in the 80s, and then after we do that flashback, it comes back. So it's in the text, not even hidden. And then you have other context clues, like there are songs being listened to on the radio, MTV, the top song on MTV, and that's in Astra's chapter. I think it's chapter 2. And so there are context clues. But even getting outside of the context clues, it's blatantly stated in the book. And she did go back and edit, oh yeah, okay, did say this, but I missed it somehow. I'm gonna leave that statement in my review that I didn't know what year it was. So there are certain things that once you set off a reader, they're gonna be like, okay, I hate this. I freaking hate this. I'm gonna take this in the worst possible way. And that's not even something done on purpose. I know that when I'm reading a book, I typically have less comments to make about a book that I'm enjoying because I'm just sucked into the book and I'm living with the characters and I'm just wanting to see where they go and what they're doing. However, if I run into logical issues, if I run into things where I'm questioning what the character is doing, if I run into technical issues that bother me, I'm going to be further away from the story, and I'm going to be far more clinical in reading the story because I'm not even interested in what the character is doing because I don't trust the character. I don't like the character. And so rather than something being malicious or somebody being a dog crap reviewer, and I think you see this in all sorts of things, if somebody doesn't want to like something, or if somebody is poised to not like something, or if somebody is triggered to not like something, they're going to be harsher on it. And I'm not saying anything on whether they are good or bad, or if your opinions are valid or invalid. What I'm saying is if you go in poised to hate something, or if something triggers you into already disliking it from the start, then you're going to be a lot less charitable in the way that you approach it because you're already looking for problems. You're already at that distant clinical view, and you're less likely to give something grace than if you're just living with the characters and accepting what the characters say. Going further down, he says, "You claim that I believe anyone can be redeemed according to Christianity. Objectively false. There are literally unforgivable sins in Christianity, and it is never stated if Dalen is redeemed." Pause. This statement comes down to explicit versus implicit. I'm not going to talk about the redeemableness of anything because that's going to be very specific to anybody's personal faith or beliefs in general. And I've got my own story that's about redemption, but redemption doesn't always look like what you think it's going to look like. But that goes over to Cain and Abel mostly. But Cain and Abel is my main story about redemption of a monster and the prodigal son. So that's a completely different thing. What is on topic is it is never stated if Dalen is redeemed. That's implicit versus explicit. You don't have to outright state something for a book to be having that message or for somebody to take away that message. And it may not be a message that you meant for it to say. However, it can still be there. And so that's not an outright lie, is all of the choices that you make in your book are going to lead up to actually saying something to the reader, whether you mean for it or not. Not only that, but a book can actually explicitly tell you one thing and mean the other thing. I'm going to use Joey as an example because Joey from my Body More series has kind of a messed up way of seeing the world because she has been so abused by her family that she sees herself as completely worthless, as she sees herself as not being deserving of the love of her best friend or her boyfriend. She gets so paranoid that there's a part in the book, I think it's in book 3, where she says that she goes out and she knows that people are talking about her and Jag because they don't look like they should be together. But they're literally just a young couple, like nobody is talking about her. But she will tell the reader that she hears people talking about her. It's untrue. Nobody cares about her. But when you're in this delusional state, when you believe something to be true, then you're gonna say one thing. And it's up to the reader to go, but is that really happening or is she delusional? You have to read into the information and what you think is legitimately true or not legitimately true based on context clues. And that's a subjective thing, is everybody's going to take something differently. I can explain to you why I thought that why the book supported Dalen being redeemed. Number one, and this feels like a retcon to me, but here is one way to look at it. I have a background in theater, and one of the things that we talked about when I was in undergrad for theater was on stage, you have 3 ways of learning about a character. And if you've watched some of my videos, you've probably heard this before, so I'm sorry. And you don't have exposition usually with theater because it's always action moving forward and dialogue. You don't have the narrative to build information, and it's usually pretty bad to have a character monologuing on stage to inform you of things. Not that you can't have monologues, because there are great plays that are full of monologues, but I digress. There are 3 ways that you learn about a character, and it cannot be through the narrative telling you who that character is. Instead, those 3 ways are what other people say about that character, what a character says about themselves, and what they do. And those 3 things can either line up or they can be in alignment. So if you've got a character that all of these other people say that he's great, and he spends all of his time helping kittens out of a tree, but then he's on his own and he says, "I am such a terrible person," you're going to not believe him. You're going to think that he has kind of a messed up view on himself because he can't see the value in his own work and he can't see how other people appreciate him. If you have other people say that he's a terrible person, he says that he's a good person, and he goes and does things, then you're going to be like, okay, those people are all wrong. Something is weird here because the people are outcasting him for some reason. If you have all of the people say he's great, he says he's great, and he does great things, then you know it's all in alignment. If you have all of the people say he's bad, he is bad, but he's doing great things, then you might be in this for an unreliable narrator and the author is maybe doing satire or is trying to show a different sort of perspective, or flip that where he's just doing good things and the narrative, everybody else, himself, say that he's bad while he's doing good things. That could be mental illness, that could be messaging of some kind. So there are so many ways that you can twist this based on what it looks like, from how other characters treat them, how they treat themselves, and how they act. And that includes the narration. It's not just characters that talk about the main character, it is also the narration. And the narrative voice is often either the author or another character in the book or the main character themselves. Like, the narrator is its own character with its own voice that does its own thing. And that is also going to send messages to the reader. So when it comes to Dalen and the idea of was he redeemed? One, the main question of the novel is anything redeemable? If you look at any of Shad's interviews that he did about this book where he was talking about Dalen, he always posed the question, is anything redeemable? And he said that he set out to see if he could make the most disgusting character, one of the worst bad guys that there is, and then see if he could redeem them. Like, that is what the stated goal is, which means there's going to be an attempt to redeem him, to see if he could do the thought experiment of redemption, which has to mean that you somewhat believe in some kind of redemption for this person. And even just stating that means that you believe that there is some level of redemption for every single kind of person, or else there wouldn't even be a thought experiment, because it's like, well, why would you do this? Unless you don't personally believe in that kind of redemption, but you're trying to see and test other people's redemptions while you don't think that this guy is redeemable, because that's also possible. You can write things that you absolutely don't believe in, to thought experiment other people. But that's never said in any of the interviews, which means it gives the implication, the impression that you do believe in any kind of redemption, which isn't right or wrong, by the way. This isn't there's no judgment here on where you believe redemption ends or starts. Again, that's a personal thing. But what I'm saying is, based on how you present yourself or your story in those interviews outside of the context of the story, it's going to give implications of what the story is about. And with the very context of, can this character who is extreme be redeemed? It's posing that as the main thematic question of the story, which means readers are going to go into the story looking at the elements to see if the book supports or rejects the thematic question that was presented. And then the readers are going to infer what is done with those elements. So then when you get into the story, you have Dalen who says that he is sorry continuously, throws himself off a cliff, is reborn with endless magical abilities that he can just expand at will, basically. As he goes through the story, he becomes a hero by defeating the Shade, by defeating the communists that are hiding underneath that one building. He's speaking out against the people that he thinks have the wrong ideas and would like to shut them down. And this isn't to say that he is a flawless character, because he is selfish, he is self-serving. You see that throughout the book. He still has his tyrannical inclinations. And so you have to weigh it with that. But the book is constantly rewarding Dalen, where he is winning all of his battles, where nobody can beat him. You get to the end of the book with an actual trial where, even though he's saying, I am so sad, I am so upset, I don't believe him. Like, let's just obviously, I think that he's lying the entire time. And he's lying to the reader because he wants the reader's sympathy. No, he wants everybody's sympathy. One of the things that affects the idea of his redemption is the fact that he is constantly telling everybody else that he feels so bad, and other people are assuring him that he is a good person. Like, he's in jail, and he tells Eric that if he's given the death penalty and he dies, then leave him dead. And Eric is like, okay, but There's the fact that everybody is crying over Dalen's death once he dies, as opposed to seeing him as the tyrant that he was and being like, ding dong, the witch is gone. I think there was a kid that was like, we shouldn't celebrate this. We should mourn this because he actually saved us. And so it's constantly giving this idea that he should be praised for what he did. And in the end of the book, he gets basically knighted and put on the police force with his unlimited powers that nobody can stop him for. He even had handcuffs on to like limit his abilities that the narrative said, or Dalen said, he could escape from them at any time, and he didn't. So basically, the society has zero control over him, and he can overtake whenever he wants to. He can become the tyrant that he was whenever he wants to. And so it's basically, it looks like it's giving him a second chance. In general, people are in agreement that he gets to go and do justice things now, despite what he is, instead of just having him be in a stock and be punished forever. That is a symbol, that is implied forgiveness, that is implied redemption of starting anew. You don't have to explicitly say, and this was his second chance. By putting him in that position to start anew, to get on top of being a law enforcement officer, which is considered a protector of the people and an authority, it is implying that he has a second chance to do a better job, to be a better person. And that's the same message that it started with, where he threw himself off the cliff and then he was like, hey, I'm young again. I have a second chance. I can do this. By the end of the book, the implication is that he is getting to start over as a law enforcement officer. Now, there's another way. There are other ways that you can take this, including, oh no, the cycle is about to begin again. He's going to rise to power and become a tyrant again because he's young. He's got a second chance. He's got more power than ever. There are many ways in which it could go. And depending on how you write the ending, it can have different implications. But so it never stating outright that he was redeemed does not negate the fact that people may take the elements within the book as if it's saying that he was redeemed, he was forgiven, he's being given a second chance. And I understand this because I write a lot of things that rely on the readers to sort of pick up the tidbits and piece things together. Like Joey having a moment where she kind of forgets where she is and is having a second of PTSD when she goes to Jag's house in book 2. I never say in Boom 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 that the United States government is evil, that the Ukrainian government is evil, that the Russian government is evil. It's going to be up to you to look at how the characters are interacting and what is the message there. I also never actually say that family is important in those books. However, what I put in the themes and the way that the characters move forward is that Jan's family is there for him, that his family chases after him when they think that he's in trouble, and that you can't really trust the government because the government's, all of them, were using this child. But it never straight up says that. However, other people are going to look at Boom and see some of the elements and then think that it is just trying to rip off the war that happened the same year that it came out, even when it was written beforehand. Anyway, that's getting into the whys of you don't have to outright state something in order for it to express something. You say that Auric is wanting to be a warrior monk. False Auric was a warrior in the past, but is trying to live a life of pacifism and only takes up the sword against enemies reluctantly or due to a greater anger. Both of those can be credited to a misreading, which I've had my own misreadings before. It just happens again, which is why discussion is fun and interesting, as people can turn you on to how you may have misread something or what things mean. I can't tell you how many times somebody has told me how they read something and I was like, that's a good point, actually. I see what you're saying. And it's actually made me like something more. But you can't do it aggressively or you're just gonna like turn people off to understanding where you're coming from. There's a line here, you call Dalen an incestuous sodomizer and yet he never engaged in incest or sodomy and is actually repulsed by those things. Okay, it never said that he was... This being the defense, right, okay. You got, well, the incest for sure. It never said that he did incest. It did say that he had sex with girls as young as 14 and then made them have sex with each other while he watched. It didn't say how he had sex with them. So for all we know, anal could have been involved. It just... That is going to be an assumption based on the reader one way or another. I just think that's kind of a funny distinction to make. Don't worry, guys. He may have raped 437 women and girls, but he did not use the back door. I don't mean to laugh at something traumatic. I just think that that is hilarious. You say Dalen is cracking jokes while eating pastries right after murdering people. Literally never happened. The only scene he's eating pastries is after he returns to his home, and it was a long time since he was in any conflict in that scene. There are many times he is regretful, and he never cracks any jokes after committing violence. It's been a while since I've read this book, but I feel like that might be referring to when he was running around the city, ripping dicks off of child molesters and throwing them out the window after Kool-Aid Manning into the room. You know, he was like sitting there listening for the cries of pain so that he could run off and go and rescue everybody in the city, and then he came back and sat down with Eric as Eric was eating breakfast or something at a cafe waiting for him. I feel like that might have been what the reference is. But also, that's a weird thing to hone in on, specifically to just go, he did not crack jokes while eating pastries. He cracked a joke. He did not have a pastry in that scene. It was Eric eating in that scene. That just feels like a nitpick, but That's what happens when you start getting personal with the reviews. You say that Dalen is better than everyone else at literally everything when acknowledging his many character flaws, that he's an asshole, completely missing the point that he's very bad at communicating with people and very bad at controlling his temper. It doesn't matter that he is better at fighting. It doesn't matter that he is stronger than literally everyone on the planet, that he can manifest his strengths. He has a temper and he is bad at communication, okay? This is something that I think a lot of newer writers actually struggle with, is creating flaws that actually affect the story and actually matter in the story. It's kind of like when you make a female character's only character flaw that she's clumsy, but it doesn't actually affect anything. So if you say that he's got a temper, if you say that he's got communication problems, but then it doesn't really reflect in the story and doesn't really make things complicated, and he doesn't try to work through it, then it's not really a character flaw. Like, it is a character flaw, but it's a superficial flaw because it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't stop him from getting what he wants. It doesn't stop him from doing anything. And he never actually stops to look at his temper or look at his communication. And maybe this was something that would have come forward in future books, because I also understand that if you're doing a serial, then you're not going to necessarily solve everything in the immediate book. Is you might set things up. I know that especially because Joey is very, very difficult in the first book of Bodymore, very difficult in the second book of Bodymore, and the third book is where she kind of starts actually getting better. The second book, she does start learning things, but the third book is when she really starts correcting herself. And so possibly this was setting up to do that, but we'll never know if future books never come out, and then this is just how it's going to be. That's always a difficult thing with flawed characters in serials, is you have to give patience to the character in order to explore the bad parts of what they are or who they are, because that's going to be something that's fixed later, because you can't like fix it in the first book and then have nowhere to go in later books. You claim he is a Mary Sue. When he fails and is defeated multiple times and is hated by most people, you clearly don't even know the definition of a Mary Sue. I'm not even going to address Mary Sue because it is such a loaded term that people use for anything and everything in order to dismiss it. And the funny thing is, in a lot of books, everybody does hate the Mary Sue because it has to do with the main character syndrome, where they hate her because they want to be her, or they hate her because she is all powerful. And the fact that they hate her is because she's supposed to be the implied good guy and they're the implied bad guys. So maybe that's something that's sort of lost here, is look, most people hate her, so he can't, most people hate Dalen, so he can't be a Mary Sue. I've read enough fiction where the main character is arbitrarily hated by everybody in their circle, and that is like a designation of how they're the good guy and everybody else is the bad guy, because they basically spring away from the main character as if they're made of holy water, as evidence of everyone else's evil. Here you say that Lyra forgives Dalen several times in your review. False. Lyra explicitly never forgives him and is very clear about that. She says he is nothing to him in the end. Again, it is amazing that you could misrepresent the book very clearly. Again, this is another area that is going to be an implicit or inferred thing. What I remember is she cried about it when he died, after he risked himself for it. She was not angry at him anymore. And then when she was paired with him in the end to be the buddy cop thing, she just sort of accepted it as how it was going to have to be. Meanwhile, she was, having panic attacks throughout the rest of the book, which shows forward momentum, which again, going back to my last point where I talked about having things where the series is going to go in the future, where she ends at the end of book 1 sort of gives the idea that if he's not forgiven yet, he will be forgiven in the future, because you're making strides forward into that lane. I think it was just really, really a bad decision to be like, I'm going to pair these guys as buddy cops in the end. And again, it's this assumption that if you read into something, then you're doing it maliciously, as opposed to just reading the elements and saying, this is what I read into them, this is what I saw, this is the implied text. You claim that Dalen learned nothing from his fall. False. If he learned nothing, he would not regret his past or acknowledge his mistakes. Yet he continues to make the exact same mistakes, act the exact same way, has the exact same mindset, where he believes that he is the arbiter of justice, where it is his good heart and his morals that allow him to murder and sodomize and abuse. That's possibly where the sodomy came in, by the way, is because when he killed Blackheart, the space pirate, he shoved a pike or a spear or some sort of sharp object up his anus. So he did sodomize his own son with a spike. And the way that he kills people is very, very brutal. So possibly that's where that is coming from. And I also didn't believe that he learned anything. I didn't believe that he actually regretted his mistakes. I felt like he was putting on a show and he was constantly lying. I mean, how else do you explain crying so hard about what you did that you die and then you immediately resurrect? I think I've used enough of those points to kind of really show what it is I'm trying to get at here. And that is the implicit versus the explicit, the battle of the hidden versus the overt, which is really going to change how you read a book. Some books you're possibly going to read more into the actions or the implied actions or the implied perspectives. Like another thing that I do with Bodymore is I don't ever really say that Joey and Jag are dating for like the first book and a half. I think it's actually Stone that mentions boyfriend and girlfriend from the outside because he sees Jag and Joey together and is like, assumes their relationship because it's obvious to him. But Jag and Joey never say it because Joey has issues with commitment and kind of fears that commitment because of what happened with her parents. And so they're kind of an unlabeled thing, even though they are devoted to one another and they are dating. But that's something that you're going to have to read into by watching the behaviors. And something that often gets overlooked is, and I've faced this specifically, I've seen this specifically in giving reviews and people going, that's not in the book. Where did you get that? Sam Fenna did that to me. Shad Brooks's fans did that to me. And it doesn't matter if you state something in a book if I don't believe you, because readers can disbelieve the narrator. And I think that some newer writers don't fully understand that mechanic in a book. And so they try to overcompensate by telling you how to feel about the character, by trying to tell you exactly what to think, to make sure that even if the character goes over and does this thing, like they already told you, this character is a good character. So if they go over there and murder somebody, they've been told they're a good character. Or if they go over there and they help a kitten out of a tree, but they say they're a bad person over here, then you're going to accept that it says that they're a bad person, and not that that is their mental state, not that that is their personality, not that they could possibly be lying to you as a psychopath, trying to get your sympathy so they can rise to power. And I'm sorry, I'm thinking a guy that's killed, 27 million people probably is going to be psychopathic. Probably is not going to have problems lying to you most of the time, unless I see something in his behavior that shows me that he has a conscience. But I'm not going to randomly assume that he now has a conscience. It's going to be something you have to prove to me. And I think that people sometimes miss this idea that readers who take something different from them can see that, may infer that the narrator is lying to them. Because there is such a thing as an unreliable narrator, whether you do it on purpose or not. And so then some of this misunderstanding where you think that you're very, very clear because you're like, I wrote it in the text. It is obviously opposite of what you said in the text. You can say that. But if I infer something different based on different elements, it doesn't matter what you tell me because you can distrust a narrator. So I would like to ask you guys to tell me of a narrator that you've read maybe recently or someday, I guess. Tell me of a narrator that you read one time that you really didn't trust. And it doesn't matter if it's what the author was going for or not, but have you read a book where you just did not trust the narrator? Another book where I didn't trust the narrator was in ACOTAR / A Court of Mist and Fury. The entire second book is spent rewriting the relationship that Feyre had with Tamlin in the first book. And so while she's lying to my face and lying to the faces of the people in book 2 to become their allies, I'm knowing exactly what happened in book 1, how Tamlin was with Feyre in book 1, everything that he's done for her, and I'm seeing her misrepresent it. So she ends up looking like a villain. And I don't know if that was the intended purpose, because you look at all of the people that really, really like Feyre, and they don't see her as gaslighting the reader or lying to her new comrades. I also saw this in His Name Was Augustin, especially with Joel. Oh my gosh, with Joel, where Swanee would try to defame Joel to the readers while we're sitting there watching him be a good husband in all of his actions. And then she lies to my face about him abusing her when he's not. And then you think that I'm gonna trust the woman whose husband is a dark priest and who cheated on all 4 of her husbands throughout the book and then justifies her cheating on her husbands? But if somebody wants to like Swanee, they're going to take her side and they're just going to accept what she says. And that's just a different sort of reader. The readers that only accept what it is that they're told. You can almost look at this sort of with Jan, who accepts exactly what he's told as he's told it for the majority of Boom, until it's like he can no longer just accept what he is told is true. And the reader knows from very, very early on that something is fishy, that these guys are fishy. By early on, I mean the moment that the feds walk through the door in their freaking vacation garb in Ukraine in the spring, like, that something is off. But Jan is just accepting what he is told. He's not inferring anything. He's not reading into their actions, the way that they present themselves, and he just kind of goes with it until he can't. And it gets more confusing because not every book has an explicit versus an explicit message, or the book doesn't even try to do an implicit message, because sometimes it's just not there. And you look at Sold, the book by Patricia McCormick, I think her name was, that I reviewed on this channel a little while ago. There is no implicit messaging in that. It's just about explicitly saying that human trafficking is happening and it's dangerous to girls and you can do something about it, because the whole ending of the book has that. But then there is an even more explicit message in that book at the end of it, in her author's note, where she says what her goal was in writing the book, and that was to inform that it was happening, that she did interviews, and that it was a nod as well to some of the organizations, or a friend of hers that she knows of who works in those organizations to try to help the trafficking overseas. Or you look at stuff like Trick, which I did on Thursday with Ellen Hopkins, where again, with that book, I would say there isn't an implicit message. The explicit message is that trafficking of vulnerable children happens. And it's that explicit message is then echoed. And if you didn't have her interviews and you didn't have her messaging at the beginning and at the ending of the book, there really wouldn't be a message. It would just be teens being abused for me. Don't do drugs. Drugs, sex, and religion will kill you would be the implied message. Anyway, if not for that, but then you get to the end and it's got an explicit message where it says the reason that I wrote this is because of child trafficking, because of the child prostitution numbers in the United States. So I wanted to show how different types of kids can end up selling their bodies. So that becomes the explicit message of the book. And sometimes you get that explicit message of the author saying, this is why I wrote the book. Now there being an explicit message doesn't take away from the fact that a reader will have an individual experience with the book, interpreting the book. And if there's an implicit message that they took away from it, it may be different than what the author intended. That is where you start to get into dangerous territory of readers kind of assuming what the author believes or what the author's intent was, especially when it's meant to become an attack on the author or the author's morals or ethics or character, which you see coming out a lot when people don't like an author. It's also not to say that authors' beliefs don't go into their books, because personally, I believe that we write the things that we are obsessed with or that are very meaningful to us. And it comes out in different ways. Sometimes it comes out in a very straightforward way. Sometimes it comes out in a very veiled way. Sometimes it comes out in a very roundabout way. I know what shows up in a lot of my books are broken families, people finding families, people working their ways through the traumatic things that have kind of affected them in really, really big ways. But everything that I do always comes back with hope. And so much of my work has to do with family. Dead End Drive has to do with a family unit. Bodymore has to do with the family and how families have been affected by, and the way that families have been affected. Like if you look at Jag and how his family affected him, Joey and how her family affected her, Ralph and Casey and what family means to them. Ralph's entire MO is to find a family. He's always just wanted a family, and he's never been able to find one until he gets Casey. And then he'll do anything for his family. And then in Boom, Jan is very close with his family, and then his family is there waiting for him when he comes back. So if you look at a lot of my work, all of it has to do with family. I know that in Still Not Dead, which I might work on next, Harland is suffering from the sins of the father. As far as I know, that's what the plot is there's supernatural things that kind of cling to him. And if he gets too close to anybody, a miraculous thing happens and they die. And so he is very alienated and isolated for himself. And he later finds out that it is this idea of the sins of the father haunting the son. If you look at the Westies, you've got the Cassidy kids, and they cared so much. Their father loved them so much, and their father was such an important figure in their life. And then their father is taken away, and they they are just a little family unit and they're all each other has. And that story becomes a story of healing and expanding their family and building a community. The story with the aliens that I'm now developing with Monty has to do with the Kors are my alien race, and their people were just wiped out in this attack by some of their enemies, except Khan and Malik were not on that planet. And so then Khan kind of takes it upon himself to become the leader, because there are some Kors spread throughout the world, throughout the galaxy from doing jobs, but they have nowhere to return to. And so he sort of takes it upon himself to, one, find who killed their people, and then two, rebuild the society for his people to return to so that they can continue their ways, build their families. And the Kors' entire culture is so community and family based. The Easties is filled with familial relationships and the importance of family. And so you see in what I do, so you'll see constantly in everything that I do, different representations of family, and it's something that I am obsessed with writing about. You'll also see redemption and forgiveness. Casey and Ralph's story is one of redemption and forgiveness. And as much of a hottie as Casey is, I am anticipating people to see who Casey was and not forgive him. And that's going to be a personal thing, because everybody has a different measures of what they're willing to forgive. And you know what? I can't blame anybody. He killed some people when he was a ghost, okay? So that's going to be up to anybody to determine where their line is at. And nobody is really wrong. That's why book discussions, characters, these thoughts are so interesting. So I think bottom line is there are different ways to read books. Implicit, explicit. There are different ways to write books. Implicit, explicit. So if you're an author and you're creating, just know that you can never fully control how readers will interpret your work because of this implicit understanding. Let's go back over to the chart here really quick. And we've got implicit communication often requires interpretation and inference. Explicit, clearly and directly understood. Context. Implicit often relies on context and prior knowledge. Explicit, less reliant on context. Examples: implicit, reading between the lines in a poem. Explicit, a straightforward instruction manual. Clarity versus inference. Implicit can be less clear but allows for depth. Explicit offers clarity and precision. So this might be an interesting thing to go and look further into if you haven't really explored explicit versus implicit. This is how we end up reading the same stories but getting completely different interpretations of them. This is how we can read the same lines and get completely different interpretations from them. Just know, if on an individual basis, somebody says, "How are you?" and you say, "I'm okay," and somebody can either take that as you meaning that you're okay, or read into the tone of voice that you said it with and take it in a completely different way. That same thing can be done with stories, and that same thing will be done in stories by strangers who don't know you, who will take what you say in completely different directions. Rather than assuming the worst from everybody that comes at your story in a way that you don't necessarily agree with or understand, I think you can expand your empathy and understanding of other people by trying to get to the bottom of why people saw what they saw. This is super helpful. This is one of the reasons why critique partners are super helpful. This is one of the reasons why critique partners are super helpful, because they can tell you what they see from a perspective that's not you, that you maybe never even realized was a thing, because it's just so different. This is also why I think that good writing is also an exercise in extreme empathy. That is, you're going to write people and try to understand people that are very different than you if you go into it that way. Not everybody goes into it that way. Other people want, candy stories, which is fine. Some people want, this is the hero, and that's fine. Some people want to mood write, and that's fine. But it can be an extreme exercise in empathy, whether you are trying to understand where a character is coming from or to extrapolate what is going on in the story, or you are just experiencing it. So with that said, let me know what your thoughts are down in the comments below. I feel like the implicit/explicit kind of gets lost constantly in book discussions, because it's always like, if you don't get what I'm saying, if you didn't take what I said as the way I said it, as the way I meant it, even when I clearly wrote it in there one way, then you are dumb, or you are malicious, or one of these things. And I have been called those way too many times by authors who can't stand people reading things against what they wrote. Maybe take a chill. It's just book discussion. And quite frankly, I generally like it until it gets personal. Then it's like, how do I help you? But that said, let me know what your thoughts are on explicit versus implicit storytelling. Any experiences that you want to share. Do you typically read stories just as they are written, or do you look for underlying context? With that said, have a great weekend and don't die.
Was that Wayland Cross in the trunk? Do you know, or is that something that's still being figured out?
The person in the trunk was not Wayland Cross.
Is he in trouble?
We don't know who did it, but as the owner of the car, the longer he's missing, the worse it looks for him.
Cross isn't a killer. For the last couple of years, the average number of murders in Baltimore has been over 300, and it's been going up. Mind you, that's only whatever the badges count as official murder, and believe me, there are people that don't count when they die. Wayland? If you're down here, tell me. I'm not talking to the badges, I've been looking for you. They found a body in your trunk. Why? Did you do that? To the left, plain black letters read along the wall. You walked in the corridor. Once that ends, you chose the dark is on the right. My vision goes blurry, flickers black and black and black for longer intervals until I can't see anything at all. I'm not screaming anymore, but my voice echoes back to me. Where the hell am I? You're dead, Josephine. Even smart people do stupid shit sometimes, right?